Welcome, everybody. We're glad to have you join us tonight. My name is Noreen Ambrose. I work for an organization called Cows and Fish, and we're glad to have you with us tonight in our third in this series of responsible recreation topic for tonight. I'm going to bring up my presentation to give you a bit of an opening introduction of what we are going to be doing this evening. So this session and this whole series are being presented by Cows and Fish in partnership with the Environmental Law Centre. And the series is going through February and March, and we're glad to have you join us this evening, and hopefully perhaps you've attended some of the other evenings or daytime sessions, and we'll attend the remaining ones coming next week as well. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we although I'm based in Lethbridge, we are hoping to reach out to people across the province, and we have participants on from many locations. So we want to acknowledge the lands we're on and in, and that is the Treaty 6, 7, and 8 territories, which are traditional treaty, traditional territories of many, many different First Nations in Alberta. If you're attending from some other location, we encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories that you are on and in. We also want to acknowledge the Métis nations and the other First Nations whose footsteps and experiences have traversed these lands for centuries and millennia, which has led to, of course, a lot of experience and knowledge gained and that connection to the land that we are on and in. So again, please acknowledge the traditional territories you are on and in. If you're joining us tonight from a random posting that somebody shared with you or a Zoom link that was forwarded to you, we encourage you to sign up for the rest of the speaker series so you'll get the notifications, and the link to that is on the bottom of your screen on the right hand side, which says the Winter Speaker Series on Eventbrite. You do have two choices each week to join us for the same topics, each Wednesday and Thursday. Wednesdays at 1 or Thursdays at 7 p.m. like tonight. So next week the same thing will be the case. So you can pick whatever works for you to explore these riparian stewardship and regulations interconnections. So if you haven't attended already, you can go and look at the recordings for the riparian restoration and bank stabilization topic, which was our first, as well as the second one, which is livestock crossings of waterways. Those are available on our YouTube channel, and you will get links to those after attending as well. So you can watch them at your leisure or go back and refer to them to remind yourself. And tonight's session will also be posted within a few days. So again, we encourage you to attend all of them, and hopefully we'll see you again next week as well. If you haven't done Zoom before or haven't done it a lot, you'll notice that your video is off, except for our panelists. We have no video function available to the rest of the audience. Your audio is also muted, and your raised hand function will not be used tonight. You might find that you want to put comments in, and we'd really encourage that in the chat function. There's kind of a single comment bubble. For some of you, that'll be at the top of your screen on the right-hand side, and for others, that might be on the bottom. Again, feel free to add comments throughout the evening. If you have actual questions, though, we would like you to put them in the Q&A box, which is sort of two chat bubbles woven together, and that says Q&A for question and answers. So feel free to be putting questions in there at any time. We will get to them after each speaker and at the panel session at the end as well. Again, if you're not really familiar with Zoom, you can play around with the view you like. If you want to be able to just see the speaker's face and adjoining their presentation, you can change the view you like, or you can go to a gallery view, which will show you all the panelists' videos if they're on. And that function is usually in the top of your screen, and you can play around with kind of what layout on your screen you like. So just a reminder that that might be helpful for some of you who haven't used it before. So you might ask why Cows and Fish and then the Environmental Law Centre are working together. Well, we have really mutually valuable mandates. Cows and Fish's role is to help promote the understanding of healthy landscapes by fostering a stewardship of these places and encouraging that knowledge. And Likewise, the Environmental Law Center does a lot to educate people on related to the environmental laws and rights, and that's to support clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment. So a really good relationship for us to host these together. Most of you that have joined us probably know what a riparian area is. If you don't, these are the places next to most water bodies. Streams, rivers, lakes, and wetlands all have this transition zone that's affected by that extra water. It's highly variable in size and width, but it's influenced by that extra water and that water table that the roots of the plants are keeping their, their feet wet, essentially, whether it's at the water's edge or near the water's edge, and in the floodplain and the shores, where that elevated water means different kinds of soils and water-loving plants. It also is the place that we expect and hope is performing a whole bunch of ecological functions, which results in many benefits and values for us. And if you expect a riparian area to perform these functions, it needs to be healthy to do those things. And so that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about tonight. If we're doing things to keep or restore health, we need to do that within the context of the appropriate regulatory understanding, whether there is a lot of erosion or bare ground or loss of vegetation or unraveling of the stream and it's moving sideways and down where it shouldn't. Sometimes we want to restore things, but also sometimes we're trying to do things to keep healthy conditions, and we need to do that restoration and management in the context of using regulations and following them appropriately. So we want to get a sense of who's joining us today. So I'll ask our helpful assistant Jonathan to post the poll. You should see on your screen. You can scroll down. Not all of the descriptions might fit in your visual part of the poll. You might have to move it a little bit. Pick the best fit for you. And we recognize that not all of you may see a perfect fit in here, so please put that in other, and put yourself in the chat box as well, how you would like to be described for future sessions. We're trying to summarize all sessions together, so we realize that there's quite a broad range of attendees that could come to these, including those of you involved in recreational communities. So if you just click on it, whatever is your best fit, and then once you're done that, you'll hit the little submit button, and that'll allow us to get a sense of who's joining us today. So I'll just give it a few seconds. And while I'm doing that, for those of you that have already filled it in, we'd also encourage you in the chat function to just tell us, where are you at? Like, where are you physically located and attending from today? Just gives us a sense of where people are viewing us from. So I'll just thank you for filling that out. Most of you have already filled out the poll. And you can see that there are about half of the people that are coming from non-government or conservation or agricultural groups, and a mixture of other individuals from a host of other choices. So thank you for joining us. Regardless of where you're from or what you do, we're really pleased to have you with us today. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm Noreen Ambrose with Cows and Fish, and I'm acting as your host this evening. Our first speaker will be Jason Unger, who's with the Environmental Law Center, and he's going to talk about the regulatory side of things, and followed by Jason will be Gary Clark. And he's going to talk about some of the projects and activities that they have been doing in the Crow's Nest Pass area. So, and that each of them will have an opportunity to have individualized questions after their session, and then we'll do a combined question and answer session at the end, and then wrap up with a couple summary comments and questions for you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason to bring up his presentation and get started. And again, a reminder, you can enter questions into the Q&A box at any time throughout the session. If you're having a technical issue, you can put that in the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to assist you.
Thanks very much, Noreen. Can you hear me okay?
Sounds good. Take it away, Jason.
Okay, great. So thank you for attending tonight. We've been doing these for 3 weeks, so it's great to have more and more people coming out. Excuse me. And tonight I'm going to be talking about general recreation regulations and their impacts or their potential impacts on land and water, and what type of laws apply to mitigate or prevent those impacts in Alberta. For those who have attended other sessions, you'll note that some of the content around foundations of our law is similar because of our water laws and our laws around beds and shores. They have a broad application across things that cows and fish obviously hold dear and work hard to protect and deal with. So a lot of these foundations are similar, but basically what we're going to be talking about today is more specific to issues around recreation. And really we're split the regulations into two portions, one relating to the water. So Noreen had shown an earlier picture of Riparian Area. And certainly the shoreline and the bed of a water body attracts a specific regulatory framework that is different from the uplands. And today I'll be speaking to both because I know that recreation issues arise in both areas. And certainly the regulations apply in both areas, certainly on the upland more related to crown land, and then in the water body itself, again, dealing with a lot of the crown land issues because the bed and shore are owned by the crown. So when we recreate near water bodies, it's important to understand the nuances around the law and where it comes from. It's a challenge for the law, I have to say that out front. The land and water connections that we know, hydrology, water quality, sedimentation, erosion, all these types of things are connected. So if we're undertaking activities on the landscape, whether it's recreation, industrial activities, there's that land and water connection that the government, through its legislation, attempts to deal with. And that extends to the aquatic environment as well. And then there's the Canadian Constitution. So under our Constitution in 1867, there wasn't a lot of environmental consideration put in. Who deals with the environment is an ongoing question and a contentious question often because the federal government has certain jurisdiction and clear jurisdiction around fisheries, inland fisheries and coastal fisheries, as well as areas around species at risk, as well as navigation. And we'll talk about that a bit more. And whereas the provincial government has clear legislative power and jurisdiction over provincial lands and resources, as well as private property and civil rights in a variety of other areas. So the Canadian Constitution also feeds into this kind of confusion and dual regulatory system that applies to water bodies. And then finally, we have the common law. Often the common law is reflected in our legislation. So in our statutory law and regulations, often that is made up from some of the common law principles, but some of the common law still applies to today. So the common law is basically judge-made law over the years and over the decades, really inherited primarily from Britain, although it's influenced by other common law systems as well, Commonwealth countries. But that's been adopted and forms a lot of our foundational law. So why do we want to know about the laws? Obviously, there's risks involved. So if we don't know the laws, we're more bound to potentially violate them and get fined. So this is a story from 2015 showing how a couple of off-roaders were in a river and got fined. And more recently, a motocross club was fined under the Federal Fisheries Act and the Species at Risk Act in an area, Racehorse Creek. And so the implications are significant if you do end up violating some of these laws and there's an enforcement action that results. So in the legal landscape around recreation, unfortunately, if I channel my inner Lord of the Rings fan base here, one regulation to rule them all, unfortunately, that's not how it works. It's quite the opposite. We often have a variety of laws that apply to recreating on Crown land and specifically in water. We have the Provincial Public Lands Act, we have the Water Act, common law might come into play, we have the Alberta Land Stewardship Act and regional plans that may come into play. The Municipal Government Act may come into play in certain instances, not in all instances, but sometimes municipalities may take measures where there's a role for them around water bodies as well. And then federally, as I mentioned, the Fisheries Act kind of plays the highest role when we talk about recreation around water bodies or in water bodies. So if we back up a bit and talk about the foundations of water law, it's common law where when settlers came, obviously we brought with us a bunch of the rules of Britain as settlers to this country, and a lot of it revolved around common law rights. So the right to divert water is a riparian right. It's a property-based right, and it's basically the ability to use and to basically use the water for reasonable purposes. But there is also an obligation to not impact downstream users, so downstream riparian owners. So in this figure, the parcel A by the river is a riparian owner, and they have both a right and an obligation related to that riparian right. Whereas figure B, parcel B, has no riparian rights because they have no surface water body flowing by them. So for the country like Canada, and specifically Alberta, the southern portion of the province where it's always been quite arid, this was a problem. The riparian system was an impediment to settlement. Also, and fundamental to the discussion around recreation in water bodies is the common law rights of navigation and fishing. And these have been adopted and continue to exist to varying degrees today, but they have also been adopted into our legislation. So I cite here a 1921 case out of the Alberta Court of Appeal, where it notes that the public right to navigation and fishing is reflected in a presumption that the Crown owns the bed and shore of the water, of water bodies, and not just the water itself. So the notion here is that there is always a common law right recognized to go onto a water body and navigate, as well as to go and fish. Now, of course, as we know, fishing and navigation both have rules related to them now, both federally and provincially. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of this was codified into the Northwest Irrigation Act, which is federal legislation in 1894 and carries forward into provincial legislation today. And if we think about it, how the land and management of the land has evolved back in the 1670s, ownership of much of the land base in Canada was basically deeded to the Hudson's Bay Company as part of Rupert's Land. That was deeded back then later to Canada. Of course, we can talk about treaties and all that other interesting area and the impacts on that, but that's a topic for many other days. But as you can see here, 1898, Alberta is still not a province, so the federal government still plays a significant role in how water is managed and how land is managed, being a lot of public resources, a lot of public land still at play. So in 1905, Alberta joins or becomes a province. In 1930 is an important year as well, where the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement occurs. And then our first water-based law occurs in 1931 in the Water Resources Act. And that kind of adopts some of the key principles that water in the province is owned by the Crown. And then other laws adopt, and we'll talk about the Public Lands Act, that the bed and shores of water bodies are also owned by the Crown. So the public lands situation, for instance, the Water Act in 1949 had the words, the beds, shores of lakes, rivers, streams, or bodies of waters and former water-covered areas, which is an interesting phrasing, were owned or vested in the Crown. Some of the lands prior to the NRTA and prior even to Alberta becoming a province were deeded to rail companies primarily. So some water bodies are still owned by rail companies or the successors of the title of those rail companies if it was passed on. But that's quite a limited number, and I'm not sure what that number is, frankly. Then in 1984, the Public Lands Act added the words permanent and naturally occurring water bodies, which is of interest because it kind of reframes what land is Crown owned versus what land, for instance, if the water bodies beside private land, where the private land starts and stops and where the Crown land starts. So if you look at the Water Act today, it says the property and right to diversion and use of all water is vested in the Crown. The Public Lands Act, for its part, says all permanent and naturally occurring bodies of water, the beds and shores of those entitled to those beds and shores, is vested in the Crown. And it's interesting to note that that's permanent and naturally occurring bodies of water and all naturally occurring river streams, water courses, and lakes. You'll note that permanent isn't applied to the river streams, water courses, and lakes. And that's important because some more seasonal types of waterways, or water courses, I'll call them, can still be retained by the Crown. So we can think of lakes, for instance, that are slowly changing or fluctuate through year to year. Just because there's not water there doesn't mean that all of a sudden it's not Crown land. And the government has developed policy around how they determine what is permanent, and naturally occurring is more of a question of fact in the history of the land and that type of thing. So what does that all mean? So there's this idea that the Crown owns the bed and shore, the Crown owns the water. So what does that mean? Basically, it means that you can't do a lot of activities on the land base unless you have the proper authorizations. So that would be under the Water Act or under the Public Lands Act. And those are the two main pieces of legislation. That being said, when we're talking about recreation, there's a variety of other pieces of legislation that apply. So no activity without an approval is under the Water Act, and an activity is broadly defined. Similarly, the Public Lands Act says no person shall cause, permit, or suffer loss or damage to public land, impacting on watershed capacity, harming the bed and shore, or injuring the bed and shore, and that type of thing. And I'll talk about a specific provision under the regulation that is even more detailed and specific to the bed and shore. So basically, the question becomes whether you need an approval. And an activity under the Water Act is broadly defined that it can include disturbing land, vegetation, or other material with the possibility of impacting flow, direction, or quantity, siltation, or impacts on the aquatic environment. There's a variety of other exemptions under the Water Ministerial Regulation, but none of them really apply directly to recreation itself, although as Gary's going to talk about, stream crossings and water body crossings do have an exemption where a code of practice under the Water Act can apply to those structures. Then there's the Public Lands Administration Regulation. So this is the specific one where it says no person shall enter or occupy vacant land that is a bed and shore of a permanent and natural occurrence. I'm not going to continue to read that, but basically it's saying you cannot occupy the bed and shore without an authorization. So I have section A here, which just talks about the types of recreation that are allowed, not surprising, involving boating and stuff like that. But then there is a provision to say, if you have a grant or an authorization by the government, then this prohibition doesn't apply. And that might take the form of a temporary field authorization or of a licensed occupation in some instances. So what is the bed and shore? How do you know what the line is? You look to the Surveys Act, and it's basically the notion that the water is either removing vegetation or it's influencing the vegetation in such a way that you can delineate that line as a surveyor. As I mentioned, there's a process to undertake those activities that are otherwise prohibited. So approvals under the Water Act or exemptions by regulation. And then under the Public Lands Act, as I mentioned, these already, I'll continue on. At this stage, I just want to flag that there can be a municipal rule as well in some instances. So under Section 60 of the Municipal Government Act, a municipality has the direction, control, and management of bodies of water within the municipality. And really, I think this might occur most specifically if there's private land that's been subdivided. There may be things called environmental reserves that might exist, in which case the land around the water body may very well be owned by the municipality. So if a subdivision authority at the time of subdivision decides that an environmental reserve should be taken around a water body, then that land is transferred to the municipality. And public access to those lands really depends on the municipality. The municipality can judge whether or not to allow access to those lands. And finally, we have the Fisheries Act. We're not going to deal with the Species at Risk Act or the Migratory Birds Convention Act to any great degree, but the Fisheries Act has two main provisions. First, Section 35(1), and I'd say this is the most relevant of the two. No person shall carry on any work, undertaking, or activity that results in the harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat. We often shorten that to the HADD, H-A-D-D provision. And there's also a provision that prohibits releases of substances that are deleterious to fish. So this is of note because it is the bigger case that was more recent around a motocross race where the director and a club were charged under the Fisheries Act and the Species at Risk Act. And there is basically a significant fine that was issued by the court. And we can talk more about the case if people want to. So if we switch gears then to upland, there's a whole host of regulations that apply as well. And the difficulty in having a summary about what the regulations are is it really depends on how the Crown land is designated. We have what's called vacant public land. We have public land use zones. We have recreation areas and recreational trails. And we also have land that isn't vacant public land. There's a disposition on it. So by a disposition, I mean basically a grant given by government, whether it's a mineral surface lease or a grazing lease or that type of thing. And I'm not going to go into any great detail around some of these things, although it's important to note that basically vacant public land is defined as that land which is not associated with the disposition. And those dispositions, as I mentioned, could be grazing leases and licenses, mineral surface leases, pipeline agreements and leases, all those types of things that the public land department can issue agreements to offer to the public or to companies to occupy that land. And the starting point for the Public Lands Act is that a person who occupies public land and isn't a holder of a disposition or otherwise authorized by the Act or regulations is deemed to be a trespasser. And any improvements you make on public land become Crown property. So that's the starting point under the Public Lands Act. Now, under the regulation, though, there's a whole suite of areas where occupation is not trespassing, that occupation is allowed. Specifically, more so from vacant public land, there's fewer regulations in that regard. But the regulations go all over a variety of things, whether it's access, whether you need to keep on specific trails and how you use conveyances like off-highway vehicles, camping, fires, pets, all those types of things really have a variety of rules related to them. I know in preparing for this discussion, some of the rules around pets were more substantive than I thought, in terms of very strict in terms of either leashed or within specific sized steel enclosures or a travel carrier. So it's quite limited. And then we have certain other rules. So for public land use zones, there's a variety of things at play that are dictated by the actual public land use zone. And then there's some broader, more general regulations at play as well. I'm not going to go through them here because it would just probably be more confusing than anything. And then finally, I just want to note that other places have other rules. So wilderness areas, forest reserves, other areas might, or other legislation might come into play that basically overrule, it's probably not the right phrasing, but basically those rules apply, whereas the public lands administration regulation does not apply in those instances. Two more general rules that I wanted to highlight is really that there's a host of rules, but I think a lot of it comes down to more simple principles. First, no person shall interfere with the rights of others to the quiet and peaceful enjoyment of public recreation areas, unless it's incidental to a disposition, so incidental to a lease or that type of thing. And then the general idea is that you leave it how you find it. Whether you're camping or you're using an area, the premise often is referred to as a leave no trace principle. So both those types of principles are embedded in the regulation. And finally, the final slide, I promised, there's also a general rule against destroying any resource or removing any resource, including firewood from public land. So I wanted to highlight that as well, because oftentimes that can be an issue if people start chopping down trees on public land or removing firewood and that type of thing. They can get permits for that, but as a general starting point, that's not allowed. And oftentimes the government provides firewood at a lot of these sites, or you can use deadfall on vacant public land as well. So that sums up a very big topic in a very short time. So I invite questions now, or we can move to the next presentation. I will stop sharing. I think there was a hand raised. I saw a notice at one point.
Yeah, it went away because it's a function we weren't really planning on using yet. But that there is a lot. Like, it's amazing how many different things there are, Jason. So thank you for at least getting us started on thinking about those things that do exist, and how our recreation might be related to those regulations. I encourage our participants to again put your questions in the Q&A box, but maybe first I'll ask you, Jason, like, which of these things do you think, maybe give us a couple examples of things that are quite often overlooked? Maybe you don't know a lot of like big fines that make the court cases or the newspapers, but can you give us a couple that you think are quite common things that are overlooked related to our topic tonight?
Well, I think it's just a general lack of understanding or knowledge, and frankly, it's a tough thing to be on top of. Is around the Fisheries Act specifically is needs to be a knowledge of if there's fish in those stream beds or in other areas, and so there needs to be a high level of knowledge when you're interacting with these spaces, especially if there's a risk of siltation and that type of thing. So I think oftentimes we get situations where people assume it's a minimal impact, but depending on the time of year and the type of habitat that's there, it can still have a significant impact. So that's one of the things. And also, I think just the general perhaps misconception that the Crown owns these things, right? That the bed and shore are owned by the Crown. So how I often think of it is in terms of property law, right? So we wouldn't have people building a bridge on our yards or on our acreages without permission, right? It's kind of, and so the starting point for me is to say, well, think about it as a property right that the Crown has, and so the permits that are in place are to protect the property of the public of Alberta. So I think those things, I think it's just a perception that oftentimes we don't communicate those things, and so oftentimes it's just by a lack of awareness that some of these rules are in play. But I think that it's a challenge because there are so many rules and they can differ over time in space and all those things.
Yeah, thank you. And just a reminder for our listeners and viewers, Christina is putting in lots of the links that Jason's been referring to, including the last one, which he just mentioned about how do you know where there are fish. There's some links in your chat function to watch for those. There's a couple questions, Jason, for you. So this one is about target shooting. So in the Ghost public land use zone, as an example, there is currently increasing target shooting occurring. What are the rules around this, particularly since it can pose a public safety hazard and is disruptive to wildlife?
Excellent question. And I can say that I don't know the specific rules around the ghost clues, as often they call it. So, but you can go online. And I know that the public land use zones do have online, there are different things, and maybe I can try and find it later in terms of readily accessible kind of charts in different zones of what's permitted and what's not permitted. So there are rules around firearms for sure, around how where they're allowed and where you can use them. Often there's restrictions about how close you are. I know, for instance, if there's a grazing lease or that type of thing, or a fenced livestock area on public land, then there's some restrictions or setbacks that have to be abided by. But I don't know the specifics for the ghost on that front.
Right, because they can vary, obviously, depending on location, which is why it's important to know when you're in and which exact. But it's true to say that many places on public land, there are places that shooting is allowed, like use of weapons. Obviously, hunting is allowed, and then I guess target shooting is a type of using a weapon and a firearm in that regard.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's any discernment between like the use of a firearm for hunting purposes, other than
versus targets, right?
Targets, right? Yeah. Gotcha.
Okay, so another question for you. Let's see. Is more of a comment maybe, but you feel free to add to it if you like. It's that what seemingly sometimes is an innocuous activity may not be a big issue if only one person does it, but if hundreds or thousands take part in that similar activity, especially like during the pandemic numbers when things are going up, this is a real cumulative effect. I don't know, do you want to comment on that? Yeah. From like, how's that relevant to the regulations?
Well, it can be relevant to how they're interpreted and enforced, for sure. So, for the example, the motocross race, that was an issue that the court had to deal with, saying, well, if just one person is driving a quad slowly through a water body, then it's like how that could be established as a harmful alteration is much different than having a race where there's hundreds of people racing through it and creating sediment and doing those things. So you're right. And obviously on a broader time scale and a broader geographic scale, those cumulative effects add up. And certainly that goes for recreation, but it goes for all of our activities on the landscape, right? So.
Right, absolutely. And Christina or one of our other helpful support folks right now have put in some information on the firearm use into your chat function for you as well. So maybe I'll just encourage our audience to please put questions in the Q&A box, but I had one that struck me from what you presented. Maybe you could answer, Jason. You said that the Public Lands Act, of course, influences occupation. And I don't know if you can answer this specifically, I'm hoping you can, that obviously people do camp on vacant Crown land, or, the camping in the backcountry aspect. What allows them, because they obviously don't get a disposition, what allows them to camp in the backcountry?
Right. So the Public Lands Administration regulation allows for camping and a variety of other uses of vacant public land, so long as you're not doing certain things. So you're not, I'm not sure who would camp in the bed and shore of a water body, for instance, but you're not camping in excess of 14 days, or you're not creating certain risks to that public land by how you're operating on that public land. So the regulation creates this broader exemption for vacant public land. As we go into the other designations, there's more limits as to where you can have fires or where you can camp or where you can travel. But on vacant public land, it is quite broadly open through the regulation.
Great, thank you. Are you able to expand a little bit more, I mean, kind of whether it's somebody who's camping or out there for a day trip or whatever? You mentioned the sort of the Forest Act can play a role, but can you talk a little bit about the tree cutting, and that would be, I guess, most specifically maybe related to riparian, and would it influence the Water Act as well, and sort of the use or burning of trees or cutting of trees? What can you tell us a bit more about that?
Right. So generally, the timber is owned by the Crown as well. So other than certain specific provisions that allow you to burn, for instance, firewood that's provided, or fallen timber, or that's already dead, essentially, there are limitations around that, but you can get permits as well for those uses. From the Water Act, and in terms of shoreline, I think that's you might need temporary field authorizations, for instance, in some cases. And I think it often depends the nature of the impact you're having. Obviously, whether it's foot or boat or OHV, we have various impacts on the landscape, and there's always some level of impact no matter what. But it's about minimizing those impacts and that type of thing. So the Water Act can come into play if your activities create a risk of ongoing sedimentation or erosion. Then that would trigger kind of the broader Water Act approval process and whether any exemptions apply there. So.
Great, thank you very much. Since I don't see any additional or new questions in the Q&A, I just want to point out to those of you that aren't familiar with it already, we do have a whole bunch of links posted in the chat that are links to the kinds of things that Jason's been talking about, the public lands disposition process, the camping aspects, the fisheries review. So just a reminder that those are there. And since we don't have any additional new questions, I'm gonna say thank you very much, Jason. We'll pull in some more Q&A time with you in a bit. And I'll ask Gary to turn his video on and his microphone and start pulling up his presentation. And I will introduce Gary while he's doing that. So welcome, Gary.
Thank you, Nuri.
So while you're getting your presentation up and running, I'll just read a little bit of your introduction. And once you've got that up, that's great. So Gary is the president of the Crow's Nest Pass Quad Squad. And sorry, I should say it's Gary Clark, for those that don't know Gary and can't see his little screen descriptor. He's been with the president for over 6 years, and the Crow's Nest Pass Quad Squad is a volunteer-based nonprofit that's been around since 1998 as an incorporated group. They promote safe, responsible riding in the Crow's Nest Pass area and maintain the present provincially designated trail system in the Livingston Range, the Porcupine Hills area, and Castle Parks. Gary has been involved in the planning of the Livingston Management, Castle, and Wildland Management plans. He's on the board of the Castle Parks Management Plan and has also just recently finished with the implementation of the Livingston, Porcupine, Bob Creek, and Castle Management Recreation Advisory Group. So he's pretty involved in this stuff. Their organization has worked with ourselves, Cows and Fish, the Old Man Watershed Council, and others on riparian work, along with the Government of Alberta staff on trail design, building bridges over water, moving trails away from water, and physically repairing eroded trails, moving surface water off those trails and into the forest. So the Quad Squad has a lot of experience and have installed over 80 bridges in both the Castle and Livingston over the years. And they plan to do some more of that by putting bridges over waters on designated trail systems. So Gary's going to talk to us about some of the recreation use and management experiences they've had. So thank you for joining us, Gary, and take it away.
Great, thanks, Maureen, and welcome everybody to the webinar, and thanks again to Cows and Fish for inviting us to give our presentation and also as a panelist with Jason. So As Noreen said, we've been involved with building bridges and repairing trails and stuff for a number of years since 1998. I've been with the club probably for about 10 to 12 years, and when we moved to Crow's Nest Pass, that's when I became more involved with it. But just to give you an idea of what we do, our mission is to promote responsible use of Alberta's Southern Rockies and to ensure the conservation of our wilderness areas for the continued use of future generations. We are focused upon sustainability and place high value on safety and rider education. We have a very proactive program of multi-use trail maintenance, including maintaining present bridges and the installation of new bridges on existing trails over previously non-bridged waters. Our goals and objectives are to eliminate the impact of OHV and other traffic from the creek crossings, to increase awareness, promote and educate users of our backcountry with respect to protecting our water resources from siltation while improving fish habitat. Just to give you an idea of what we did last year, we actually manufactured 3 40-foot steel bridges and placed them on 3 water crossings on the Salamander Trail and the Spoon Valley Trail. The Salamander Trail is the connecting trail that comes from the Atlas staging area over to the McGilvery staging area. We also had one other bridge that's already on the Salamander Trail that was only 68 inches wide, which we're fine when the bridges were just being used for quads, etc. But now we find that with the side-by-sides, we need to go to 73 inches. So that particular bridge was also widened at the same time as we put these bridges in. There's an awful lot of volunteering going on with our club. I think last year we had close to 3,200 volunteer hours for the whole year. And this particular project was 200 volunteer hours. And we also repaired about 25 kilometers of trail along the York Creek Road and the plane crash trails. Half of the work was done in the Castle Parks and the other half was in the Livingston Proos. We took out an old narrow bridge and replaced it with a 60-foot steel bridge just off the York Creek Road going into the plane crash. And the cost in kind for this project was around $44,000 using 338 volunteer hours. All 3 bridges have been decked with wooden planks, and I'll show you some photos later on how we do that. 2 bridges in the Lil Valley were widened and better approaches were made. And all of this work was pre-approved, of course, by the government of Alberta and obtaining the required permits from forestry and also from parks. I know Jason had talked about the TFA, which is the Temporary Field Authorization Permit, or the TAFPA, which is the one for Castle Parks, or any park actually. We're going to show you that as well later. In fact, we're going to show it to you right now. So this is what we call a temporary field authorization. This is just a blank form. It's fairly simple to fill out, but we do need permission anytime we do any work inside the public lands or inside the provincial park. Then we need to have the government's permission, and we need to lay out what we're going to do. We can't just go in and build a bridge. We need authorization from the government to do that. And in particular, especially on critical habitat streams, then we have to also look at not only the provincial regulations, but also the federal regulations as far as fish permits go. So this is what a TFA looks like. Again, it's a fairly simple form. It usually takes anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks to get, so we have to do this in advance. And this particular slide is a filled out TFA. And what we had to do in the past was we used to have to every year apply for basically a general maintenance agreement, so that we didn't have to do a TFA every time we wanted to go out into the public lands and clear deadfall off the trails or repair water holes or that type of thing. So now we've gone with a 3-year plan the government has given us, and it's just for general maintenance on any of the designated trail systems. So just to start with, when we build bridges, you can see on this area in here, this is actually recycled plastic. It's made from a plant out in Nobleford. And we used to use steel parking blocks actually, and they go right underneath the bridge. You can see there's a lip here, and this is basically the weight of the bridge holds these blocks in place and make sure they don't move, etc. But we used to use the cement blocks. They were probably about 500 pounds. These recycled ones are about 150 pounds, so we can easily move them on, load them and move them off the trucks and stuff to get them into the backcountry. Not to mention the environmental concerns of cement, how much pollution is caused by making cement compared to recycling these plastics. And the plastics are actually recycled from Pincher Creek area, Crow's Nest Pass, and Lethbridge. So it's nice to be actually using some of the products that we have recycled in the past. This photo is one of the bridges that we put in last year in the fall, and it is on just off the York Creek Road, heading towards the plane crash. It's still in the Livingston Ploughs at this point. We had an old bridge in there that was, again, 68 inches wide. And what we do with these bridges is we actually basically cut them right down the middle, and then we reinforce the bracing and then re-weld plates on to the bottom of the bridge to be able to widen it. And this is just showing you the strength of these bridges. These bridges have all been, have an engineer stamp on them. We paid money back in the early days to have these bridges designed and engineered properly. And this particular machine that we just recently bought last year with a grant from the provincial government weighs 9,800 pounds. With the operator, you're looking at basically 5 tons. And when we drove over this bridge, it didn't bend, it didn't even flinch. So just to give you a strength of what these bridges are, and especially in the wintertime when there's a large snowpack, etc., then you can show the strength of the bridges. These next slides are in the Spoon Valley Run. Again, it's a long connector trail that goes around Crow's Nest Mountain from the McGilvery staging area and then over to the Atlas Road and then down through the trail system back to the Atlas staging area. So the little yellow, or old yellow truck is what we call her. That's how we haul the bridges in. And I'll show you some pictures later on how we actually do that. So there's the bridge right now is where this fellow is standing, and it is literally dragged over across the stream. And on the photo on the right are photos of the guys that are actually doing the decking on the bridge after it's in place. And the decking allows 2 things. One, we put runners on down the middle for the snowmobiles in wintertime so that they don't have to cross the streams unless there's a snow bridge. And also for, we have had livestock go across a few of them, and also the equestrians are able to go across it because it's a wooden deck. So again, now we have the bridge in place. This is just a short little 30-foot bridge. And on the right picture, of course, you can see the trail that has now have the bridge across it. Now these pictures are actually our first run early June of last year. And this is again on the McGilvery connecting trail, or the Salamander Trail. And you can see by the erosion on the left, the water and stuff that's on those trails. And using our mini hoe, we've been able to do some tremendous work last year, and we're really pleased with the result of it. We have actually raised enough money to go out and purchase a small 33 horse tractor to be able to more or less groom the trails or to smooth the trails out. So in this picture here, this again is on that same Salamander connector trail, and you can see the amount of water in here. Now this is not a stream, it is strictly rainwater that has accumulated on the trails. And you can see that right now they're digging a trench off so that this water will naturally drain into the forest floor and not go into any of the existing streams nearby. We will continue to keep these drains open so that when we do have the spring rains or the snow melt-offs, then that water will simply drain out and we don't have to do this every year. The middle picture is showing us, this is a spring that has sprung up around the trail, and right across on the bottom, right where, actually that's me that's there, where I'm standing there's a culvert underneath, and so we dug a ditch to have that water get off the trail and then go through the culvert and then down into the forest floor. And the picture on the right is just showing some water that is presently running down the trail. This is on the Willoughby Trail, and then it's showing pictures before of how deeply the erosion has gone down directly down the trail. And you can see the after pictures of how we've flattened the trail out. And the main thing that we do is to prevent the erosion from just coming back, is that we build what are called swales. Now, swales are basically a hump on the trail that is on the downhill side. And then you can see a little bit off to the right, but this is where we're starting to dig a drainage area so that the water goes off the trail, is not running down the trail, and again goes in the forest floor where it's safely absorbed. I'm just going to stop sharing here, and I just want to show you some other pictures. So this is a project at Little Valley a few years ago where we put some major bridges in. This is about a 60-foot bridge.
Gary, just remember, you need to reshare that item.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thanks.
That might help. There we go. Can you see it now?
Yep, we sure can.
Okay.
Just go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. So this is a project that we started a few years ago, actually. The OWC and Cows and Fish came out. Actually, Noreen was out busy swinging a hammer, decking this and helping us put these bridges in. But you can see on the back end here, right where this fellow is standing, there's a set of wheels, and it's kind of like an old logging truck, or not an old logging, a new logging truck, where they have the back end of the trailer is here, and then this part is filled with logs, and they have another trailer up here. So this is actually, the bridge is actually secured to the rear end of these trails, and then the other end goes on to the back of Old Yeller here. And we also have pins and stuff, so we can take the pins out and use the quads to actually turn the wheels and go around 90-degree angles and stuff. We do have to cross the stream a couple of times. Once to get the bridge across a wide stream such as this. And then again, this is another stream that we did on the Little Valley. Going back to the original one that we had, this is, again, you can see the wheels, and we had to drag it across and then winch the bridge up. And this is just showing us preparing the decking that goes onto each bridge. We are lucky enough to have Spray Lakes donate us a bunch of rough lumber to be able to deck the bridges a number of years ago. And these are getting rather raggedy, and again, Spray Lakes came through and donated a few more lifts for us, so we're good for the decking of the bridges. Again, we're just loading up the wood to go to these bridges in Little Valley. So We just also want to mention that we must take steps to ensure that any trail system conforms to relevant environmentally sound scientific research and data, and to ensure that the concerns of waters, ecosystems, and wildlife are adequately met. We must stay on designated trail systems and clearly place signs indicating which trails are designated and for what user group would be extremely helpful. We've made a number of recommendations, some of them along the ones that we've had in all the management groups that we've been involved with. And kudos to both governments, the NDP and the present Conservative government. An awful lot of these recommendations have been implemented and made into legislative law. So we're getting away from that wild, wild west thing, and hopefully we're moving towards a much better sustainable system. Thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you very much, Gary. It's really interesting to see those the many sites you've been on, and recognize a couple of that I've been on. And Gary, if you want to, we'll do a couple of questions if you want to keep your video on. One of the things that struck me in this is the volume of the work obviously you've been doing, as well as sort of the connection between the stuff that's at the stream and the rest of the trail, obviously. But how long, you mentioned that you've done kind of a maintenance TFA, which was for three-year term. How much area, I guess, would that include, or how many kinds of projects would that include for those that, you know, want to do something similar in their area?
Yeah, it's hard to say because we have, there's no defined area. We kind of say that we come from basically Isolation Creek in the north down through Dutch Creek and right down to the bottom of the Castle Mountain park trails that are presently designated. We don't know what's going to happen from the minister's decision, but right now they're still a designated trail system. So yeah, our area covers a fair amount of distance. We've done work up in Isolation Creek, for example. We've done work with Cows and Fish and OWC, of course, in Dutch Creek area. So yeah, there's a lot of areas for us to cover.
For sure. Once the bridges are in, like you said that you guys are doing ongoing maintenance, what about liability or ownership since it's on Crown land? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we basically, once we put a bridge in on Crown land, then it basically becomes the property of the Crown. So they are more or less responsible for the safety of it and stuff. And that's why we work so closely with them to ensure that we're doing the proper installation and the proper ways to make sure we have all our fish permits and everything else. Christine Sweet is who we deal with locally down here, and her and her staff have just been excellent in giving us assistance and guidance.
Great, thanks, Gary. There's two questions for you that are kind of related. The first is, do you guys have a membership fee that helps pay for maintaining and creating? And then likewise, kind of follow-up question is, what other kinds of maybe private or corporate donations have you received, I guess, to help make all this possible?
Okay, yeah, excellent questions. First off, we do have a membership fee. We have roughly, depending on the year, anywhere from 250 to 350 members. There's a $35 single fee, or there's a $50 family membership fee, which is good for the whole year. We do a number of fundraising. Of course, the pandemic really put us in a bind, as everybody, I'm sure, is in the same boat, that we would do fundraising such as barbecues or bartending at weddings. Also our yearly raffle, which we've just started, in which we raffle off side-by-sides, and this year there's trailers and stuff and everything else. That usually brings in a fair amount of money for us to survive on. So we're also hoping for what's called the Provincial Trail Act, which has been proposed to the government. And basically, it's going to be an additional fee that's put on to your registration, such as $30, for example, on top of your registration. And then this money will be administered, they haven't figured out by who. It's going to be the government or the Alberta Off-Highway Vehicle Association, but the money that's collected through through that program will then be divided up amongst the certain clubs, which would give us a tremendous amount of money to be able to do even more work than what we're doing. So we're hopeful that's coming into place. There's a number of issues with it, but again, that's the minister's decision, and everything's been submitted. So we certainly hope that that's possible.
Right. A few more questions coming in, and maybe I'll ask Jason to join us. The next couple questions are going to be for Gary, but we'll kind of open up the panel. So feel free to submit questions to both of our speakers. Gary, maybe a couple more for you. Can you tell us, once the bridges are up, are off-highway vehicle operators using them, and do they stick to the designated trails or make their own trails? What is your sort of observations in that kind of role?
I think in the last few years, Noreen, there's been a great educational push on. And before, and I've said this, and I'll say this publicly, when I first started Quad, I had no idea what I was doing. And I was probably one of the worst offenders. Hey, it's fun to splash through the water. I honestly didn't know any better. And then when I became involved, particularly I think when my first seminar that I went with cows and fish, that's when I realized, hey, what are we doing here? And I think that factor is a lot. That was some of the recommendations that the Alberta Off-Highway Vehicle Association gave, was to even have something like a course that you have to have before you get a trail pass to be able to go on the OHV trails. So that's certainly a great idea, and to explain the waterways and how the damage that OHVs do to the waters and stuff would certainly go a long way. So yeah, that hopefully answers your question.
Absolutely, and I know certainly I'll encourage our participants to put comments in the chat on that topic too, but we've certainly seen a real growing interest in doing things well and right, and most people just didn't realize, like you said, I think a lot of people didn't realize there is an impact to driving through the creek or up and down the creek, and that's harmful to the water quality and the fish and riparian health, and not just at the site but downstream. So it's really good to see all the things you guys are doing.
If I could just add to that, Marina, absolutely. I mean, that was like Jason said about the people that were fine that were riding up and down the waterbed and stuff. Every Quad Squad member is encouraged to report that to the provincial authorities. You can actually call just the fire line or their emergency number and report it, and they will follow up with it and do the fines. We're trying to self-police ourselves as well, but it's a long haul.
Yeah, absolutely. Jason, do you want to maybe comment on that case that you talked a little bit about before, that Gary's just talking about what was the infraction or the reason for the fine? Can you explain that a little bit? And the one I think you posted in one of your slides.
Right. So there was actually there was a couple of fines for being in the bed and shore provincially, but the larger prosecution related to Fisheries Act, harmful alteration of and disruption of fish habitat, as well as a prohibition under the Species at Risk Act, because it was a West Slope cutthroat trout area. So certainly, I mean, the work that the Quad Squad's doing is about restoring and mitigating all those harms. So I think that's key work going on. And the challenge though is for people to understand that even if they're going through streams and that type of thing, what type of habitat might be there or fishery might be there is certainly should be top of mind. And I think there's a lot of communication and education that has to go on, and the prosecutions obviously are meant as part of a deterrent system. But as I said, I think all these restoration and bridge making and all these other things are part of that mitigation process. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously the fines, like you said, are deterrent and in some cases are to help, pay for damages, I suppose, or money to go back into the environmental damages funding. But avoidance, the stuff that Gary is talking about, and putting those bridges up so we're, so we're avoiding those impacts, obviously, is kind of the goal for all those bridges. A couple more questions for you, Gary. Can you tell us, do your trails require or maybe have signage? And can you talk about that? And also, do they include funders? Like what's on your signs?
Yeah, we've actually started to just got some signs made up just saying this bridge is basically donated to the government from the Crow's Nest Pass Quad Squad. We've also used a lot of your signs as well on stay clear of the waters and use the bridges, etc., like that. So we would like to put a weight restriction on them, because the new Trail Act is going to have weight restrictions on each particular trail, and it's going to be divided up as well as where the 4x4 on-highway vehicles can go and not on designated OHV trails or hiking trails or cross-country ski trails or any other type of trails. So again, that's going to hopefully help. So the signs are great. The government has done a really good job in this last year in starting to put up which trail is for which person. In other words, they have a hiking and they have an OHV sign and a snowmobile sign, and so people know which trails they're allowed to be on now. So that's a big help.
Yeah, absolutely. Hard to use the right trail if you aren't necessarily familiar with it. And speaking as somebody who's been in some of those areas that's not there often, it's kind of a maze. And if you don't know your way around, it's not always easy to know where you're at relative to other things. So that's important. Maybe, I don't know if you can tell us, Gary, a little bit more. Have you guys done any bridges that were with other kinds of land use groups? So non-motorized, like you mentioned, of course, cross-country skiing and equestrian and stuff. Have you had any experience or interactions with other kind of recreational users doing some of this kind of work in either partnering or in other sites?
We've done a couple of hiking bridges. We have another project over at the Fireman's Park, I guess. There's a waterfall there that, or Summerfeld Park, I guess. There's a waterfall. It's an old wooden bridge that we're working on with some user groups in that area to put in a footbridge type thing. And I know we've done on stewardship days in the past, we've helped with putting in footbridges and stuff elsewhere in the land use area. But I know that the bike clubs, such as the motorized bike clubs and also the mountain bike clubs like Rock, have been putting in their own bridges to cross waters on their trails as well. So we must remember that, a trail is a trail. It doesn't matter if it's an OHV trail or a bike trail. You still have the same compaction issues and erosion issues, and moving them away from waters is the big thing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of leads to next question for Jason, actually, if you could comment on it. Do you know of any, you highlighted a couple that were motorized uses, obviously, in driving through the creek that resulted in fines, but also, were considered, that they were infractions against what they were supposed to be doing. Do you know of any, I guess, similar situations where there were non-motorized users of maybe, whether it's foot or horse or like other kinds of recreational, even maybe thinking more like lakefront activities, that might help our audience understand some of the other impacts as well, and how the regulations are relevant?
Well, certainly, I'm not too familiar with other fines of that nature. Oftentimes, for riparian area impacts, it's more of a landowner taking action that's contrary to the regulations in terms of lakefront properties and that type of thing. That is very common and a challenge as well. But that being said, certainly the way the regulations are, there's limits of occupation and certainly in the beds and shores of water bodies that those would apply across the board. But again, there hasn't been a ton of penalties or fines related to it over the years. frankly. But I mean, there are examples for sure, but most of them do deal with off highway vehicles for sure.
Thank you. A couple more questions for Gary. One just sort of about sort of your staging areas. Do you guys have or maintain trail staging areas? That's probably a fairly simple question, but.
Yeah, no, we don't per se. That's up to the provincial government has done that, and they've done a tremendous job. They just opened up. We used to have just a snowmobile staging area up the Sarataris Road, and they spent a considerable amount of money last year and made a huge open area for the staging area for both snowmobile and OHV use. And we're also looking, there's an old trail that goes through a very swampy area that we want to eliminate, and so they're looking right now at doing a different connector trail to be able to connect down to the Livingston area on the south side of the highway, or like around New York Creek area. So McGillivray and Atlas are the other two major staging areas that we have, and again, the government looks after that. They have some nice kiosks put up a year ago, 2 years ago, and they also put in new washrooms and stuff like that. So yeah, they've done a very good job on maintaining the staging area. So as soon as the trail hits, then that's where we start.
Right. Thank you for clarifying that, Gary. We're going to take a few more questions. I realize we are coming up to our 2:30 end time, but I want to take a few more questions because we did get a bit of a delayed start. So there's another couple questions that might be related to answers that Jason can help us with. So is there any case law, and this is, or examples maybe in Canada, involving the automakers? They're often promoting all these off-highway ready, SUVs that can drive through the creek, and that sort of encourages that behavior. It's definitely contrary to our laws. Do you have any comments on that, both from an education perspective as well as a law perspective?
Yes, it's a good question. Certainly, I don't think I'm not aware of any instance where they've been reprimanded or anything like that, or fined. Though one of the challenges, of course, is the laws across the land vary. So often these commercials aren't necessarily Alberta made, and so the regulation in that front. But I think it's a really good point. And I wonder if DFO or Alberta Environment Parks, everybody kind of involved says, well, why don't we change how we're marketing these things, because they are showing things that are perhaps not aligned with our laws. But it's a good question.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I don't know if this is true. My general observation seems like there's less vehicle commercials driving through the creek than there used to be, but I don't really know if that's the case, and there's just my sort of sense of it. But maybe this is a question for Gary, kind of switching gears a little bit away from the recreation and the trails, but can you tell us if you guys would support less aggressive tires to help minimize environmental damage in terms of obviously off-highway vehicles, or can you comment on that?
Yeah, I'm not a real mechanical guy, but certainly, and I know that the tires can do a lot of, a fair amount of damage, but at the same time, you also need a little bit of a tread to be able to get out of certain situations. So yeah, any improvement in the tires would certainly be great. I know the biggest complaint about OHVs, of course, is the noise level as well. And Bombardier or BRP is in the stage of coming out with electric quads now and side-by-sides, and there's also a Swedish company that has started developing electric vehicles as far as quads go. So that'll go a long way to eliminate some of that noise as well. So, but certainly I'm not a tire guy, but certainly we'd support anything that could have a lesser impact on the environment. And quite frankly, we admit that we are doing damage out there, and we're trying to mitigate that. So
Right, and that's about, you know, sustainable trail development and design in addition to maintaining them, obviously, for sure.
Right.
I'm going to cover one more question, which is going to be to Jason, and then I want to do a couple of wrap-up slides for our audience. And so, Jason, this question is switching gears a little bit, but kind of was brought on by some of the discussion we've had. This person has seen quite a lot of siltation after rain events in a bunch of watersheds, the Highwood, the Elbow, and the Old Man, and thinks that their comment is that it's probably from the cut blocks, as in the timber harvest areas, coming from those cut blocks and finding its way into rivers. Are there fines for that? And can you just comment on that, or what's the regulation related to that?
Sure, I can comment generally. I do recall there being some administrative penalties for forestry companies that are cutting too close to a water body, for instance. And then there's a variety of operating ground rules around and other rules around erosion control and that type of thing. But that being said, I think it's a very valid point, because anytime you have a road or operations, especially with the heavy equipment that forestry uses, if there's a heavy rain event, those things can result in that. And so that we do have rules in place, whether or not they're fully effective at preventing all erosion events and siltation, I have my doubts, I'd say, but that's certainly something that an evaluation of all the systems that we have in place, whether they're trails, recreational trails, or industrial trails and roads, then or industrial impacts, we kind of have to consider the whole suite of regulatory protections we have. So. You're muted, Marie.
Thank you, Jason. That was really great. I think we could continue asking and answering questions, and for those people who want to stay on for an extra minute or two, if there are some unanswered questions that are really different, we will maybe do that. But I want to cover off the last couple of things. We want to get a sense of the attendees' learnings from today. So I'm just going to share my screen again and ask our participants to give us a bit more feedback. Except that my share screen isn't cooperating, so give me just 1 second. So we've covered off a lot of different questions, and our question to you as our audience is really what impact did today's session have on you? Did you learn some new things? Did you find it useful, and will you be able to apply it? So there's 2 questions in this poll, so please scroll down if you need to and answer the role. This information really helps us respond to our funders, as well as gives us feedback to ourselves as organizers and the speakers about, continue to make sure we're providing information that's helpful. So again, once you've answered the questions, if you can hit submit, that would be great. We'll just give it a little bit longer because there are 2 questions there. And while we're doing that, just a reminder that if you want to hear this session again, this topic, or if you think somebody else would benefit from it, please do share the information. We'll be presenting tomorrow night at 7. Same speakers, of course. They'll be presenting live, and the questions and answer session will be different, as it is always. And it will be one of the nights or days will be recorded and posted live. That'll be recorded, on our YouTube channel. We will be sending out links to those people that have registered. So if you want to review anything or share it with somebody else, the recordings will be available a few days after the sessions are done for the week. So it looks like most people are done answering the poll, and most people definitely did learn something, which is great. And also, most people actually said that it's going to influence their activities or their work related to that topic, and that's really awesome. So again, we appreciate that feedback. We want to thank our funders and acknowledge that it's really important for those of you listening in. Land users, land managers, and owners are the people that do influence how the landscape functions and the health of it. So it's really important that we recognize that, and that's why we've been putting these sessions on. So we want to thank you for attending. We want to thank our funders, which include the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which includes Alberta government, as well through Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, as well as the federal government, and many other funders, both provincially and federally. So our members and supporters for Cows and Fish are shown here. And if you want to contact us, this is my information as well as Jason's. We will be, of course, hosting some more sessions, and we hope you'll join us on the next topics as well. So I'll just ask anybody who's got keen questions, you're welcome to stay on for another couple minutes, but those of you who want to move on to the rest of your day, we thank you for your time and hope you'll join us again at the next session. So thank you. So we had a couple unanswered questions that, again, this is kind of maybe more for Gary, I think. Have you been able to repurpose any industry roads for trail use, or what are the rules around those kinds of things?
Yeah, there's this big issue with the linear footprint, which we're aware of, and it's more or less to try and keep the amount of trails down. The linear footprint unfortunately includes roads and OHV trails in one lump sum. So there's a lot of trails and seismic trails and old logging trails that have been overgrown, but unfortunately the government have included those into that land, linear land footprint, I guess. And it was done more or less from just using an aerial view of area and trying to add up how many trails there were. So that part's unfortunate, but we're not really looking to expand our trail system. We do want to ensure that we have good trails and good continuity and good loops. And we've also would like to have the shared use aspect of roads such as the Atlas Road and the Saratoris and the Adnac Road, which is done in other areas of the province and basically around North America as well. So, and this has a twofold purpose. We don't want to ride on the roads, but we want to use the road to be able to connect to the other trailheads. And the roads are already a part of the linear footprint, so it's not like we're adding more to the linear footprint, just being able to use it. Any municipality has the right or the legality, I suppose, to allow any of their particular roads to have shared use with OHVs. In other words, they can allow them to do that. In the Crow's Nest Pass area, for example, any road that is within the municipality but is not in a residential area is basically deemed to be a shared use road, such as the Adnac Road and the Tecumseh Road. So yeah, that's basically it.
Thanks, Gary. And just one last question for you, I think, at this point. Oh, new ones are popping in. What kind of private and corporate donations have you guys received? I guess you mentioned your membership fees are a big part of it, obviously, and some government grants. Do you have other private or corporate?
We do. We have private grants or corporate grants are basically the same. We have a lot of people that will donate money over and above their $50 membership fee. We have corporate sponsors, a large number of them that have donated money towards our cause and stuff like that. So we're very thankful for that, obviously. And again, our raffle sales is a big fundraiser for us. So.
Right, and you did certainly mention some of the in-kind contributions, like the lumber, which from Spray Lake Sawmills, which is a corporate donation,
right,
of material. So,
right.
Great. That's all the questions that we have. I thank you guys both again for great feedback and input for us, and thank you to all of those of you still here joining us. We'll hope to see you again at the next session. Again, share the information from this week with your colleagues and friends and family. And for the panelists, we'll reconvene on our debrief session momentarily. So thank you and have a great afternoon.